mother in 5th century Gaul woke one morning to find that coins no longer meant anything. She had saved for years, carefully hoarding bronze and silver pieces, believing they would protect her family when times got hard. But overnight, the currency collapsed. No merchant would accept her money. No baker would trade bread for it. The coins that had taken a lifetime to accumulate were suddenly worthless metal. She stood in the marketplace, clutching a purse full of nothing, watching her children's faces, and realized with cold terror that the entire world she had known, the Roman world, the world of laws and roads and order, was gone. And she had no idea how to survive what came next. This is not the story they teach in history class. This is not about emperors or battles. This is about what happened to ordinary people when the greatest civilization the Western world had ever known simply stopped working. This is about mothers and fathers, farmers and shopkeepers, children and elders, who woke up one day to find that everything they had relied on, money, protection, food distribution, justice, had vanished. And they had to figure out, in real time, with no manual and no help, how to survive the collapse. Welcome to English Mindset, where we uncover the human stories buried beneath the grand narratives of history. Today, we step into the chaos of the 5th and 6th centuries, into the lives of people who watched Rome fall and had to rebuild their existence from scratch. These are the voices that were never recorded, the strategies that were never written down, the heartbreaks that were never memorialized. But they survived. And their choices, their sacrifices, their resilience hold lessons we cannot afford to ignore. The fall of Rome was not a single event. It was a slow, grinding collapse that took over a century. Barbarian invasions, economic decay, plague, civil war, all of it compounded. By 410 AD, Visigoths had sacked Rome itself. By 426 AD, the last Western Roman emperor was deposed. And across Europe, from Britain to North Africa, the infrastructure that had held civilization together for 500 years began to crumble. Roads fell into ruin. Aqueducts stopped flowing. Markets closed. Currency became worthless. And millions of people were left stranded in a world that no longer functioned. For the woman in the marketplace, the one holding worthless coins, survival meant learning to barter. She had no money, but she had skills. She could weave cloth, so she traded cloth for grain. She traded grain for salt. She traded salt for tools. It was inefficient, exhausting, and humiliating, but it kept her family fed. And slowly, painfully, she adapted to a world without currency, a world where value was measured not in coins, but in what you could make, grow, or trade. Her story was repeated across the former empire. People who had lived their entire lives in a monetary economy suddenly had to revert to barter. And those who adapted fastest, who had practical skills, who could produce something of value, they survived. Those who relied solely on money, on pensions, on the state, they starved. If this story is gripping you, if you are starting to see the fragility of the systems we depend on, then let me ask you something. If the money in your bank account became worthless tomorrow, what would you trade? What skills do you have that would keep you alive? Think about it. And if this question unsettles you, if it makes you realize how dependent we are on systems we do not control, then you are beginning to understand what the fall of Rome really means. In a villa outside what is now Lyon, France, a nobleman named Aurelius watched his world collapse. He had been wealthy, educated, cultured. His family had served Rome for generations. But when the empire fell, so did his status. The lands he owned were seized by Frankish warlords. The slaves who worked his estate fled or were taken. The villa itself was looted. Aurelius, a man who had never worked with his hands, who had spent his life reading philosophy and managing accounts, suddenly had nothing. No money, no property, no power. He could have given up. He could have retreated into bitterness and despair. But he made a different choice. He walked to the nearest village, found a blacksmith, and offered to work for food. He had no skills, so he started at the bottom, hauling coal, pumping bellows, cleaning the forge. It was brutal, humiliating work for a man of his background. But he learned, and after months of labor, he earned the blacksmith's respect. He was given a small plot of land to farm. He remarried to a farmer's daughter, a woman he would never have spoken to in the old world. And he survived. Aurelius's story is a reminder that survival often requires the death of ego. The collapse of Rome forced people to let go of who they had been and become who they needed to be. Class distinctions that had seemed eternal dissolved overnight. Noblemen became laborers, slaves became free farmers. Women who had been confined to domestic roles became traders, healers, and leaders. The old hierarchies crumbled, and new ones, based not on birth but on capability, began to emerge. But not everyone adapted. There are accounts, fragmented and tragic, of Roman elites who could not let go, who starved rather than work, who killed themselves rather than live in a world where their titles meant nothing. The collapse did not just destroy infrastructure, it destroyed identities. And for some, that was more than they could bear. Let me ask you something. Who are you without your job title, without your bank account, without the structures that define your status? Could you let go of your identity if survival demanded it? Drop a comment and tell me, because I want to know. What do you think it takes to reinvent yourself when everything you knew disappears? Children born during the collapse grew up in a world unrecognizable to their parents. They never knew functioning aqueducts. They never saw a Roman legion. They never used coins. To them, the ruins were just part of the landscape, not symbols of a lost civilization. And in many ways, they adapted faster than the adults. They learned new languages, absorbed new customs, built new identities. They were the bridge between the Roman world and the medieval world, carrying fragments of the old into the new. In a village in what is now England, a boy named Caedmon grew up speaking both Latin and Anglo-Saxon. His mother had been a Romano-British Christian. His father was a Saxon settler. Caedmon learned to read from a traveling monk, to farm from his grandfather, and to fight from a Saxon warrior. He was a hybrid, a product of collapse and fusion, and he represented the future, a world where Roman, Celtic, and Germanic cultures would blend into something entirely new. This cultural blending, this fusion born of collapse, is one of the most profound legacies of the fall of Rome. The empire had tried to impose uniformity, one language, one law, one identity. But when it fell, diversity exploded. Regional cultures reasserted themselves, local languages flourished, and out of that chaos, the seeds of modern European nations began to take root. But the collapse also brought unimaginable suffering. Without the legions, there was no security. Bandits roamed freely. Invading tribes took what they wanted. Villages were burned. Families were torn apart. And there was no one to call for help. People had to defend themselves or die. In a settlement in what is now Germany, a farmer named Hilda organized her community's defense when Hunnish raiders attacked. The men were away, harvesting in distant fields. Hilda gathered the women, the elderly, and the children. They barricaded the gates, armed themselves with farming tools, and when the raiders tried to force entry, they fought. Hilda herself killed a man with a pitchfork. It was brutal. It was desperate, but they held. And when the men returned, the village was still standing. Hilda's story is one of countless acts of courage that were never recorded. Women stepped into roles that had been forbidden to them under Roman law. They led, they fought, they made decisions. And in doing so, they began to reshape what was possible, what was acceptable, what power could look like in a post-Roman world. There were also stories of remarkable compassion. Monasteries, The only institutions that survived the collapse relatively intact became refugees. Monks took in orphans, fed the starving, cared for the sick. They preserved books, copied manuscripts, and maintained literacy when it was on the verge of extinction. In a world falling apart, monasteries were islands of stability, of hope, of continuity. A monk named Benedict, living in Italy during the 6th century, established a rule for monastic life that emphasized work, prayer, and community. His monasteries became centers of agricultural innovation, education, and hospitality. They were not perfect. They were not egalitarian. But they offered something the collapsing world desperately needed: order, purpose, and a vision of the future that was not solely about survival. For many people, the church became the only anchor in a sea of chaos. It offered spiritual comfort, yes, but also practical support. Bishops often became de facto leaders of cities, organizing food distribution, negotiating with barbarian kings, maintaining some semblance of civic order. The collapse of the state created a power vacuum, and the church filled it, not always benevolently, but effectively. But faith was not the only response to collapse. Some people turned to violence. Warlords rose, offering protection in exchange for loyalty and labor. This was the beginning of feudalism, a system where land, not money, was the basis of power, and where ordinary people traded freedom for security. It was not a fair trade, but in a world where survival was uncertain, many accepted it. In a region that would become France, a warlord named Clovis offered protection to farmers in exchange for a portion of their harvest and their service in his army. It was extortion, but it was also a form of order. The farmers knew that if they refused, Clovis would take everything anyway, or worse, rival warlords would. So they agreed. And in doing so they became serfs, bound to the land, bound to the lord, no longer citizens, but subjects. This loss of freedom, this retreat from the Roman ideals of citizenship and law, was one of the most painful aspects of the collapse. People who had once had rights, however limited, now had none. They survived, but at a cost. And that cost, that sacrifice of liberty for security, would define European society for the next 1,000 years. Yet even in this dark reality, there were moments of resistance. Some communities refused to submit to warlords. They banded together, fortified their villages, and defended themselves collectively. These free communes, rare and fragile, were experiments in self-governance, in mutual aid, in the idea that ordinary people could organize their own defense and make their own decisions. One such commune existed in the Alps, in what is now Switzerland. The villagers, cut off from both Roman authority and barbarian control, governed themselves through assemblies where every free man had a voice. They pooled resources, shared labor, and defended their valley together. It was not a democracy in the modern sense, but it was a form of collective survival that rejected the feudal model. And it worked, for a time. These stories of resistance, of refusal to surrender autonomy, are some of the most inspiring from the collapse. They remind us that even in the worst circumstances, people have choices. They can submit, or they can resist. They can accept the new order, or they can try to build something different. Not every experiment succeeded, but the fact that people tried, that they refused to simply accept domination, is itself a form of victory. If you are still with me, if these stories are hitting deep, then let me ask you to do something. If you believe these voices, these forgotten acts of courage and resilience deserve to be remembered, hit the like button. Not because I am asking, but because history should honor not just the powerful, but the ordinary people who endured. And if you want to keep exploring the truths that history buries, subscribe to English Mindset and turn on notifications. Because we are building something here. A space where the forgotten are remembered. Another survival strategy was migration. When local conditions became unbearable, people left. They walked, sometimes for hundreds of miles, searching for safer regions, for fertile land, for communities that would take them in. These migrations reshaped the demographics of Europe, mixing populations, spreading cultures, and creating the ethnic and linguistic diversity that defines the continent today. In Britain, as Roman authority collapsed, many Romano-British families fled west into Wales and Cornwall, or across the sea to Brittany in what is now France. They left behind their homes, their lands, their ancestors' graves. It was a form of survival, but also a form of exile. And they carried with them the memory of Rome, the stories, the culture, the identity, even as the physical empire crumbled. The Anglo-Saxons who moved into the abandoned territories were not conquerors in the traditional sense. They were settlers, farmers, families looking for land. They found a landscape dotted with Roman ruins, roads, villas, walls, all slowly being reclaimed by nature. And they built new lives on top of the old, blending their own customs with the remnants of Roman culture. This blending, this layering of old and new is one of the defining features of the post-Roman world. Nothing was purely Roman, nothing was purely barbarian. Everything was hybrid, syncretic, improvised. And that improvisation, that refusal to be defined by a single identity, became a source of strength. One of the most poignant survival stories comes from a woman named Galla, a Romano-British Christian who married a Saxon chieftain to save her village. It was a strategic marriage, a negotiation, a sacrifice. She gave up her culture, her language, her faith's exclusivity to broker peace. And it worked. The village was spared. But Galla lived the rest of her life torn between two worlds, never fully Roman, never fully Saxon, a living symbol of the compromises survival demanded. Galla's story raises uncomfortable questions. What are you willing to sacrifice to survive? Your identity, your beliefs, your community. And if you sacrifice those things, do you lose yourself in the process? These are not easy questions, but they are real, and the people of the collapse face them every day. Children orphaned by the collapse often found new families in monasteries, in warlords' courts, in villages that took them in. They grew up without the anchors of family, of tradition, of continuity. But they also grew up resilient, adaptable, capable of building new identities from scratch. They were the survivors, the ones who carried humanity forward, not because they were heroes, but because they refused to give up. Let me bring this into the present, because the parallels are impossible to ignore. We live in a world of complex systems, of global supply chains, of interdependent economies. We assume these systems will always function, but the fall of Rome teaches us that no system is permanent. That collapse can happen, has happened, and when it does, the people who survive are not the ones with the most money or the highest status. They are the ones with practical skills, with adaptability, with community, with the willingness to let go of the old and embrace the new. So what does that mean for us? It means we should learn skills. It means we should build relationships. It means we should not take stability for granted. It means we should prepare, not out of fear, but out of wisdom, out of respect for the fact that history repeats, and the lessons of the past are the warnings of the future. If this story has moved you, if it has made you think about resilience, about survival, about what it takes to endure when everything falls apart, then I need you to share this video. Not because it helps the channel, though it does, but because these lessons matter. These stories matter, and the more people who understand them, the better prepared we will be. Let me end with one final story. There was a family, names unknown, who lived in a villa in what is now southern France. When Rome fell, they did not flee. They did not fight. They simply kept farming. Year after year, as empires rose and fell, as armies marched and cities burned, they planted their crops, harvested their grain, and fed their children. They were not heroes, they were not leaders, but they survived. And their descendants are still there, farming the same land 1,500 years later. That is the ultimate victory. Not glory, not power, just continuation. Just the stubborn refusal to give up. Just the quiet, unglamorous act of planting seeds and believing that tomorrow will come. Thank you for walking through this history with me. Thank you for honoring these voices. If this video gave you something, hit the like button. If you want to keep exploring the truths that history reveals, subscribe to English Mindset and turn on notifications. Because we are building something here. A space where the past teaches us how to face the future. I will see you in the next story.